Tony D and Little Joan in the background, and this is a screenwriter's tips on how to put sex scenes in your movies. Yeah, sex scenes. Smash like and subscribe. Thank you for smash liking and subscribing. Thanks for checking out the Pineys books 1 through 17, available at Amazon.com. Don't forget, Kindle Unlimited is free. Why do you keep forgetting? Anyhow, so screenwriters. Let's say you got a movie that requires a sex scene. Now, these things are tough to do. I don't typically put a lot of sex scenes in my movies. There was a time back in the early 80s it was kind of mandatory, especially if you're doing a slasher movie. You had to have a sex scene. Even in a comedy, you'd have to have a topless girl in one scene. Just getting out of the shower. And these days, audiences have somehow become more prudish. And they used to say American audiences were prudish back in the early 80s. So it's kind of weird. These days, they don't have a ton of sex scenes, or the whole movie is just one giant tease, I would say, something like that. But if you're going to put sex scenes in your movie, you got to know a few things. First thing is, what kind of movie really has a sex scene in it? These days, comedies, well, if you're going to have a sex scene, it's usually a pretty gross one. It's a funny one. Probably won't have nudity in it. Back in the day, and even to this day, the three elements that are distributed overseas, the three sort of genres or subgenre of movies are horror, action, and TNA. Obviously, boobies fall in the TNA category in the sex scenes. So they would put sex scenes in just about any movie to try to get international distribution. But for comedies, it's almost pointless on that score because the comedy usually doesn't translate overseas too well. So these days, I would say if you're doing a comedy and you're going to do a sex scene, you better have a pretty good reason for it. Although these days, who the hell even greenlights comedies? You might do it to get an R rating for the comedy, for instance. Because, a lot of times they want an R rating for a comedy, especially if it's aimed at that sort of audience. But again, that's pretty rare. Usually the kind of movie that requires a sex scene is something with romance, drama, or I guess you would call it light erotica. Something that's, maybe not a porno, but is sort of one of those hotel movies that's sexy, but it's not X-rated kind of thing. God help you if you have to write one of them. So the kind of movie you'd write, or the kind of sex scene you would write, you'd write it in such a way that you aren't making the decision about whether or not what happens in the sex scene, what gets shown, right? Because if you show naked boobs, or bush, as they say, that's definitely going to be an R rating. R all the way. If you show, cleavage and like naked bodies but no genitals, that's going to be probably like PG-13. Probably. Depends. The ratings board is a little weird. And if you show any like real nudity, like a lot of times if you show nudity, or if you show, and of course if you show actual penetration, that's going to get you an X rating, or at least an NC-17. If it's like Caligula and it's practically a prawn, but for some reason they think it's art. So don't worry about that description in the sex scene itself. It's enough that you're going to have it. You describe it a little. You don't want to get too graphic unless the movie is focused on sex for some reason. Now, there have been exceptions. Sex Lies in Videotape and 13 and a half weeks. And is it 8.5 weeks? 8.5 weeks. That was it. A few other movies like that. Last Tango in Paris. I think that got an NC-17 or an X. And different eras indicate whether or not you'll get weirdly enough, the movie Clerks got an X rating for the scene where Dante's ex-girlfriend is talking about how many blowjobs she gave. So it's weird what the board will do, but just write it according to the needs of the story. In a romance, you're probably going to have the sort of sex scene that's very fantasy fulfilling, right? Normally, those are aimed at women, so they're going to be very not aggressive typically. They're going to be very flowery and nice. You want to make sure that you don't. I was writing this one screenplay, and it was a comedy, of course, for me. And I did have a scene where an older actress has sex with another character in a pool. And I described the character's body, who was this actress going to play her. And the producer was like, you shouldn't have described her body. We're going to take that out because we don't want the actress to feel self-conscious because she is older and she's going to be doing this sex scene. And we want it to be kind of funny and kind of gross, but we don't want to make her feel bad about her own body. So they kind of modified the description of the character. I had written this thing where it was like, things are flopping all over the place kind of thing. And quite frankly, I think they were going to cut that portion of it out almost completely the way they were going to shoot it. It never got shot anyway, but that was a concern why we were discussing the movie. You want to, if you're going to have a sex scene, it should be necessary to the story. Some producers will tell you, and I worked on a movie. It was a horror movie. It was in the 90s, and at the time, I think I wrote it, and the producer was still sort of in that 80s mode of horror movies where they wanted a topless girl, so they wanted a scene like that. And that was fine. I mean, I thought it was perfectly normal for a horror movie to have that at that time. Again, they're kind of out of that a little bit. So you got to sort of work with your producer on that. If you're writing something for spec, again, you could write it in such a way to let the producers or directors sort of make up their minds. If it's trendy to have more boobies back in, they'll put it in. They'll find an actress willing to do it. If not, they don't want the hassle of the actress feeling weird about it. They don't want to get Me Too'd because they don't want the girl to come back 20 years later and say, oh, I got pressured into it. I didn't want to do this topless scene. A lot of them just don't want to do it. So just be aware of that. But if it's germane to the story, then you have it in. But there's all sorts of ways you can shoot it. There doesn't have to be a lot of sex on screen. They're not actually having sex when they shoot a sex scene. They're just not having it. They're just, the an actor and actress, they're just humping around, pretending like they're doing it, but they're not. And if it's not particularly graphic, they're not even naked. They're partially naked, but not really naked. They don't need to be. They just need to give that illusion. So, don't go too nuts with it. And for some movies and TV shows, they're just completely inappropriate sex scenes, right? Especially if it's going to be like an assault. Like recently we had the Star Wars thing. God, what a disaster that seemed to, from my perspective, as a disaster. Like, why would you put a sexual assault scene in a Star Wars TV show? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It doesn't belong there. It just doesn't belong there. Not something that was, mostly for kids on a platform like Disney Plus. It just seems wildly inappropriate, way out of left field. But they did it. I think it was more desperation on Disney's part more than anything to say, oh, well, we're gonna break some new ground here and get more viewers. I don't see how that could work. But they try things. So again, make it germane to your story. Go easy on the graphic description. And I wouldn't make it too long either. Again, unless you're doing something that's erotica. But if you're doing erotica, you're really in sort of a subgenre that kind of doesn't do much. It really will just end up kind of as a hotel movie, something you would only see on certain channels late at night. It's not hard enough to be a prawn movie, but there is an audience for it. I don't think it's very big. I don't think those movies make a lot of money. There was a brief moment for them, like in the 70s, where they were kind of hot, the hot commodity to do that. And again, they would distribute overseas to some markets, but I don't think there's a lot of people looking for those kinds of movies. I think if you want to put a sex scene in your movie, you have to sort of justify it, and it has to, have a lot of flexibility there. So, and really you're just, you don't have to script much. There's probably not going to be a lot of dialogue. You can always put ad lib sexual noises, that kind of thing. But some of those scenes can be nice. The date is going well kind of thing. And then there's a little bit of kissing and whatnot. It can be romantic because, again, most of this is going to appeal towards women. Most guys aren't going to go to a movie like that unless they're bringing a significant other they've probably been with a while. It's not really an appropriate first date kind of movie usually. There's like a heavy sex scene. And it's going to be for adults, yeah, obviously. And, you're going to be aware of that too. They're a different kind of movie person. But these days with streaming, in some respects, there's going to be more channels in the future that probably will cater to these very niche audiences that do want an erotic movie or do want, another sex scene in, something. If you look at a movie like Barbarella, which they're been taught, I saw Sydney Sweeney there. I was just thinking of that. Barbarella was made, oh gosh, that was 70, wasn't it? With Jane Fonda when she was still hot. And there was a lot of sex in that. Half the movie was about sex, really. It was like Sex in Space. So, if they remake that, I would suggest it would probably be a lot less sexual. It was, again, the thing to do. And Hollywood always follows the trends. But, you can do what you want if you want to have a lot of sex in your movie. There's a reason for that drives the story forward. Yeah. And, just because you have characters talking about sex doesn't mean there's going to be a lot of actual sex in the movie. So, like, these coming of age stories with teenagers in high school trying to get it on for the first time, the movie's about sex, but you're probably not going to see much in a movie like that because, first off, the actors are playing teenagers and you're only going to see so much. They don't want to show nudity in that situation. Now, if you go to college kids, then maybe, that was Animal House. There was boobies in that. But, again, just follow your story, heighten, and, where is the sex scene going to end up in Act 1, Act 2, Act 3? Well, could end up anywhere. It kind of depends upon your story. If it ends up in Act 3, obviously the movie's sort of centered around sex a lot. Most likely it's going to be in the second act, usually when a romance is burning or there's a dramatic moment and the characters finally have sex with each other, that kind of thing, and then on to other things. And the first act, kind of unlikely. It's a little too intense for the first act. You're introducing the characters. You probably don't want to start with a sex scene. There are always exceptions, of course, but you never know. So anyway, that's my main tip for a sex scene is if you don't need it, don't put it in the movie. It's probably more trouble than it's worth, unless it's really germane to your story. So that's it for me, Tony D and Little Joan. Tune in tomorrow for the live stream where we do it live at 7. I'll be at the C-Con from 10 to 4 tomorrow in Seabright, New Jersey. And hope to see you there. We'll see you tomorrow.